welcome to another episode of Relational Introvert. And I want to thank you all for joining in for today's episode. This is an exciting and special episode because I have a special guest with me today, and I'm really happy to welcome Benjamin Warsinski onto today's episode. So welcome, Benjamin.
Thanks so much for having me.
So it's a special episode, Benjamin, because you are my very first guest on this podcast. So you are part of a milestone for this podcast and for me.
That's
How do you feel about that?
I'm super excited.
That's awesome. So I'm happy to have you on, and we'll jump right in. You and I think spoke for the first time, or like connected one-on-one for the first time, like maybe 2-3 weeks ago. And it was a great conversation. It was our opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better. And something that you had shared proactively right from the get-go was this: you had said that I'm an introvert. And that was something that just had come out naturally in our conversation. I don't think it was really an inquiry. It just came out naturally. And so where I wanted to start was, I'm curious about that. How has that piece of you being an introvert played into your life?
That's such a great question. I think it all kind of started back when I was a kid. So I would just kind of like build Lego, and like just like kind of I guess like, I don't know what the right word was. I just like would spend hours in my head imagining and building Lego and like these different environments and cities and towns. And so I would always be able to kind of be off on my own. I would either draw, or I was building, or I was reading, or things like that. So I was always kind of very quiet and kind of off on my own. And I think that kind of led into being maybe shy or socially kind of shy in school and things like that, because I was so used to being on my own in how I spent my free time.
Right. So how did that, so for you, you'd use these certain words of the quietness and the shyness. So how does that play into, like, how does that shape you, I suppose, as you progress?
Yeah. So I think like how it's kind of shaped me is that I've been able to kind of be very productive on my own and kind of in my own space. And so that's been very it's been like an asset, or like very valuable for teams and for the work that I do, because I'm able to produce a lot of work on my own very efficiently. So I'm kind of like a team of one that can do a whole lot. But I think like over time, I've become more social, more outgoing, and things like that as I've kind of just progressed through my career. Because in just general networking, it's important to get people to know you, and the only way people can know you is when you interact and things like that. And so I kind of had to force myself to do that, but it's been really really a positive skill set overall to have done that.
Right. Well, it's really interesting. You talked about this idea of you could be really productive on your own. And at the same time, you recognize that that's not the place to be either, because your work right now, what you do is, you may have the creative side that you might be able to do on your own for a little bit, but really you're doing a lot of work that is engaging other people, and a lot of times people you don't know right away. So yeah. I'm curious to find out, because the words that you used early on in describing your growing phase was this idea of imagination and creativity. So talk a little bit about that and how that has played into who you are today.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So along with the imagination and creativity, I was always like, like I had said, building these cities and towns and like these kind of immersive environments for the Lego minifigures. And that kind of translated into studying landscape architecture and urban planning in college, which was a very kind of organic, natural progression, because without knowing the professional terms, I was already kind of doing those things through play. And so that's where I started off my career. And it's really kind of interesting with the design, like the design field, because yes, like designers are creative and like we can kind of go into our own head and develop these things. But if we develop within a vacuum and then we present that and we get feedback, that feedback can be harsh or feel critical because we haven't shared that. And so in urban planning, what I really kind of liked and what I kind of drew away from that was that we don't design in a vacuum, or we don't plan in a vacuum. We have these community meetings and we facilitate and we try to get people to share their ideas and their input and have them have some ownership in the plans. And that's really translated into the work that I'm doing today, in working with organizations and either developing the brand or developing the culture or improving a team communication and things like that. It's all about the connection to people and how everyone is buying into the goal and where they're trying to go, and how make sure that everyone is on the same team and aligned so that we can move forward a lot faster together.
Right. And like what I've actually really loved about your story when you and I spoke was this idea of play that's been in your life since the beginning. So you talked about Lego being your thing, and it's part of like the work. You are a certified serious Lego, some sort of instructor. So
Yep,
you are
yep.
certified in Lego is what I'm trying to get across to everybody here. And that's actually really cool because it's a story about how play has been a really key part of who you are as a person since you were a kid. And it's really come through full circle in where you are right now. So how does that come to be? Like, how is it that you have been uniquely been able to make that connection where there's quite a few of us who maybe have not necessarily stayed connected to the play side of things that we were connected to when we were kids?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And the more that I think about that, it's really kind of like, I remember talking with my dad about what I wanted to study and what I wanted my major to be in college. And we kind of went through my skill sets, and he was like, well, you're great at design, at all these different things, at drawing, at kind of visual communication, like, maybe like, landscape architecture or urban planning would be a good fit for you. And you've also done that through Lego, so you understand, kind of all those different components. And so, he's also a licensed landscape architect, so I think he wanted me to kind of follow in his footsteps. But really, it was a really good assessment of all of the things that I had been doing all of my life up to that point, and those were the things that I was passionate about and were kind of ingrained in me, kind of came to me naturally. And so it kind of made sense to go to school and to really craft, like, hone my craft in those areas, to then kind of move forward and progress. It kind of like was, going deeper versus like branching out and going wide.
Right.
And so I just thought that was really kind of fascinating. Now that I kind of self-reflect and think back to that conversation and like how that kind of like worked. And I think that's a really important thing. So I think in answering your question, if you can think back to what you really kind of like to do as a kid, as far as like hobbies, or maybe it was arts and crafts, or it was some sort of different kind of thing that you did for play, but those skills can be harnessed and used in your career. That could also bring you joy or make work feel not as much like work, and things like that. And so I think that's something to really kind of ponder and think about.
Yeah, and you and I talked about this before, where we said this idea of play can actually seem like a frivolous activity, right? Like we
Yeah.
don't actually, even the word hobby seems like an extra thing. And maybe that's the definition of it probably too, is like it's a side thing that you do. It's not the thing that you do.
Mm-hmm.
But what I understand you're saying is you're encouraging people to look at play as the thing. Like, how do you incorporate it as part of the main thing that you do?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like I think of like Marcus Buckingham and the strengths finder, and kind of how he talks about, if you are doing something and it gives you energy, you should do more of that thing. And so often when we are playing, or we're in this state of play and it brings us joy, and like we kind of feel like we have limitless like opportunities, and anything becomes possible. I think that's kind of the mindset that you want to be in, even when you're doing your work, because because think how much more powerful you can be and how you can show up and how you can serve others in that capacity versus being in a different state of mind and trying to serve others in something that you don't really believe in. And it's so I also think about, it's so much harder to sell something that you don't believe in versus something that you truly believe in. And I think that just kind of ties in with kind of not necessarily following your passion, but figuring out what it is that really kind of excites you and gives you energy, and that you can kind of turn that into a career or a service or a product or something that can help others. And I think that's kind of the key to doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it's that idea of where does energy come from and how do you feed into that a little bit more, and that idea of leaning in. We talk a
Yeah.
lot about leaning into difficult things, right? Like there's that thinking around, when things are difficult, when things are challenging, lean into that. And there's certainly wise advice behind that too.
Mm-hmm.
There's also value into the point that you're saying is lean into the things that give you joy. Like there's just because something gives you joy doesn't make it an extracurricular activity. It could
Yeah.
very well be something that feeds you, your soul in a bigger way. What I'm curious about as you were talking I was thinking, well, what if somebody says, hey, Benjamin, I get a lot of joy out of knitting. I'm just saying it as so what like what does somebody do with that? Because that can seem like one of those activities, like what exactly is it that I can, like, what is knitting going to do for me? Like how would you, so if someone was to come to you with something like an activity that seems a little bit out of the blue from like a career choice, I suppose,
Sure.
how do you help somebody understand the bigger picture around the things that spark joy?
That's a great question. The knitting, I'm not like an expert in knitting, so I'm not sure how to answer. But I think when I think about like a quilt or the finished product, in
Mm.
order to get to that product, you have to start with a vision and a plan. And kind of if you step back from the final product, what is it? What are all the skills and processes that you went through in order to realize that finished product? And so within that, there's a lot of different skill sets that you could pull that you may really enjoy. Maybe you really enjoy the planning process, or maybe you really enjoy the vision, and you could help clients, envision what they want their quilt to be, or whatever maybe it's not knitting, maybe it's something else. But helping them envision that is a really important skill set, because a lot of people can't, and they have a hard time imagining or picturing things in their mind. And so if you can help them kind of visualize that's a great skill to have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really good point. That's a really good point, because I'm thinking even, and again, I just threw out knitting because that's just what came to my mind. I actually know nothing about knitting either. I do know that it takes patience. So as I even think
Mhm.
about that, what I like what you said, what aspect of it, because there's so many different aspects of it. There's the
Yeah.
visioning aspect of it. There's the end, like, is it the joy of the end product? And for some, it might be, I just enjoy the process of kind of sitting in the quiet and watching the needle with the thread and just kind of that. So is the detail of it something that gives you joy?
Mhm.
Then what are the things that you could get, that you might be able to get into the detail where other people are not able to go into, and other
Yeah.
people can't see it. So those are the things that to recognize joy, because sometimes, and what you mentioned Marcus Buckingham, and one of the things that he talks about is sometimes the things that we're necessarily good at aren't always the things that give us joy. We just
Yep.
we just became really good at it because by necessity or whatever, we got good at it. So pay attention to the aspects of joy. And I feel like that's
Mhm.
when you talk about play matters in a lot of your work, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and so the term play matters kind of came out of my research in understanding that creativity was the number one skill set that companies are looking for in 2020. And how do you really foster creativity? Well, you've got to create an environment where people feel safe and they're willing to share these ideas, because with any kind of creativity, there's a lot of like fail like fast and like a lot of ideas, and you have to kind of work through that and iterate, and you have to be open to throwing ideas out, and maybe they're good, maybe they're not good, maybe they don't fit the objective that you're working towards. But that doesn't really matter. You just have to be able to get them out. That's
Right.
kind of like the biggest piece, and that's where a lot of people get hung up on. They want to be right, or they want it to be a finished product right away, and oftentimes that's not the case. But so, how do companies allow for creativity? Every a company wants innovation, they want growth, they want these new ideas, and so, well, the way that you do that, to me, it's through this getting people into this state of play, and that's the one thing that's really missing from a lot of organizations and cultures, is that play is kind of this outside of the work thing, yet within the workplace we need to be creative, and in order to really progress and help our clients further. And so it's kind of funny because how play is missing, but that's kind of also the missing link to ignite the creativity and to get people excited and coming up with ideas, and helping solve these complex problems.
Right. Well, so I'm curious about something. I know that in my experience, at least, where play came in more naturally in an organization was, for example, meetings. So icebreakers, yeah, usually icebreakers, or
Hmm.
when you're running workshops to kind of solidify certain learnings or things like that, that's where it came in. But as you're talking, I'm wondering, could play be something that is maybe a little bit also less, could it be more spontaneous actually,
Hmm.
whereas it's not such an organized thing as in an icebreaker falls in here, an activity here,
Right.
how might play be a bit more spontaneous so that it's sparking creativity?
Yeah, and I think like it's the matter of the environment and making sure that employees have access to the tools. So, for example, if a company had Lego, in different areas around the office, they could just go to that room, and they could like get a couple bricks and start putting things together, and that could spark creativity, or figure out, this is what I'm thinking, and let me build this for you, and kind of share what that is. And then, oh, okay, that now I understand more of what you're talking about, because I can see this model, and I can point to this and ask questions, and
Right.
maybe we also add in this piece, that the person didn't think about. And so then you're kind of empowering employees to be creative and kind of be resourceful, and to have a tool that can help them, uh, you know find that creativity, or find the solutions to these problems.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know that as I'm talking, or as we're talking here, one of the things that's standing out to me is we used to do something simple as well, where we would have just like pipe cleaners,
Hmm.
different colored pipe cleaners that would sit on just on the table. So if we were running a meeting and there was no real intention in the sense that you need to build something with these things, it was there almost like, remember when you were kids, we would doodle. Actually, I still do. Like
Yeah.
in meetings, you sit there and doodle.
Hmm.
It's the same thing. It's a sparking of this creativity that seems mindless to someone who's looking into the doodling, but the person who's doing it is almost like there's a creativity piece that's happening for them. They're paying
Yeah.
attention and processing in certain ways. So those pipe cleaners were the same thing. And so by the end of the week, for example, in that session, some people would have built these awesome things, and others, I don't, you wouldn't quite recognize what they had built, but everyone had used it
Huh.
in the way that fit them. So there was no
Yeah.
intention, as in, to your point, like for example, the block sitting around, it's not an
Hmm.
intention of we need to build something from it. It
Right.
was there to just as a creative outlet. So in your thinking process, sometimes just the twisting, the building, the
Yeah.
drawing kickstarts this way of thinking that takes us perhaps beyond the agenda that's
Hmm.
lined in front of us. So I feel like that's the same spirit of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Well, and we also, thinking with our hands are connected to our brain, and so when we're like putting things together with our hands, subconsciously we may be processing things that we don't realize until we're kind of done with this thing that we've built, and then like the connections start coming through, and that's kind of where the magic like lies. Yeah.
Yes. Now, there's a lot of people who would say about themselves that I'm not really a creative person, or I don't really know how to build something, or I don't really know how to draw or paint or sing or dance. And this is something you and I've talked about in the past as well, this idea of that traditional sense of creativity.
Hmm.
And is that maybe boxing us in a little bit?
I think creativity is just kind of however like you interpret that, and it works across all industries. I think like the biggest piece is that you kind of continuously try different things to figure out what works, or be open to different ideas. I think that's kind of being creative. Like if you're even like, so for example, if you're like in the HR space and you have to recruit a bunch of people, and each person needs like technology to do for onboarding, but you don't have the technology yet, how can you be creative to solve that problem? Maybe it's you bring everyone into a conference room and you do like a kind of more of a traditional teaching style in order to get the onboarding information to them and to have them have this positive experience, and then you can bring the technology, their laptops, whatever, in later. But that's kind of a creative way to solve that problem. And I don't think you have to be a painter or an artist to necessarily come up with that type of solution. Yeah.
And thank goodness for that, because not all of us are painters or sculptors or builders for that matter, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what I like about the work, because that's how I look at creativity. I don't really look at creativity simply as the art side of it, even though the art side of it is beautiful, it's amazing, and what can be done in that space, and folks who can think in that space, it's amazing. That doesn't mean that because the reason I said this, is it limiting, is because sometimes I feel when we look at it solely in that contained space,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people who'd say, well, I don't fit into that. So this play stuff, this creativity stuff, the fact
Yeah.
that you said in 2020 creativity is the biggest thing, well, that means I'm out because I'm not creative.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so
and
I like
that's a really good point. And what, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but with the workshops that I run, I get people who say, well, I've never built with Lego before, how am I gonna participate? And then once they kind of get into the activities, it's not a matter of what you're building or what it looks like. It's the fact that you've put something together and there's a story behind it, and that model now contains the information. And then as you explain that, the information around the model, and you kind of share maybe like rotate the model and share the different points, the story comes out and the metaphors come out, and that's where all the detail kind of lies. And so then after the workshop experience, they come up to me and they say, I've never felt creative in my life, but I was able to do that. And the insights that I got from self-reflection and from others in the group has just been transformational. It's been just an incredible experience. And so I think we also put labels as on ourselves as to what creative is and is and isn't. And it's really just more about doing and being versus some sort of label.
Yeah, I like that. It's about doing and being. It's that idea of testing. Actually, the episode that was launched today for Relational Introvert was about running the experiment. Like that was the story behind it, and that's completely ties to what you're talking about here. Is
Yeah.
the idea of trying something, and I think the hardest part is the idea that I don't exactly know how it's going to pan out when I try it. I'm just going to try it, and it may not work, but I'm still going to try it. And the idea is not so much always the outcome that comes from it. It's also like, I loved what you said, the stories, the insights that branches us out to something that we actually it was never even the intention.
Yeah. Well, and just the fact that like you're like almost ready to launch it and you push yourself and launch it, even if you're not fully ready, that I think is so powerful, because that's like when you can actually get feedback, because you're not necessarily ready and it's not perfect. It's like, well, nothing is ever going to be perfect, but it's not like so planned out to where you're like, I know all the different details and how this is all going to go. Instead, you're kind of more like kind of open to putting it out there and getting some feedback, and then reiterating and tweaking. And when you put yourself out there in that way, people kind of can see that, and they're more open to it, because they're like, yeah, like you're trying this, and we're going to help you. We want to be along for this journey and see like version 1, version 1.2, 1.5, like, version 2. And then like so for example, like when I launched my Bricks and Brands event last November, I wasn't I didn't have everything ready. I didn't even have the stickers. Like they were in my mailbox, but I was so like amped up, I forgot to check the mail. And so I did my workshop, and I had these boxes with the Lego, but they didn't have any stickers on them. And I felt kind of embarrassed, but then when I did the next workshop and I had the stickers, people were like, "Oh wow, look at this! Like it's like it's branded and it's this and that." And so like I could see the progression from the first workshop to the second workshop, and then at like the fourth workshop, I had some friends who came. They were at the first one, and they went to the fourth one. They're like, the difference between the first and the fourth was just like night and day.
Wow.
And so I think it's just having that, being open to showing your progress. People really kind of want to help you, and that's kind of where they want to be part of your journey. Yeah.
I love that. I really appreciate what you said about this idea of if we're okay with it not being perfect at the very first launch, then we have room, one, to grow,
Mm-hmm.
right? Two, we can experience the joy of growing as well. Because to your point, you said my first workshop to my fourth one, I'm feeling good. And the people who are coming back are like, I can see a difference. So there's
Mm-hmm.
that. And then the other piece that you talked about, actually, interestingly, I was chatting with someone about this last week, with this idea of attachment. The more time we spend reviewing and looking and perfecting something, the more in love we become with every
Mm-hmm.
detail of that thing. And so then when somebody gives us feedback, even when we've asked for that feedback, we become really possessive and like,
Yeah.
whoa, what do you mean? And so even though that person's giving us feedback exactly in the space that we asked for, we're not as open to it because we're so in love with, we're so attached to what got created. Whereas if we had been willing to, you know what, this is the first iteration, I will now take it out here and see how it goes. I'm also not as attached, and I'm okay with the fact that somebody comes back and says, you know what, I would next time I would suggest XYZ. You can say, yeah, you know what, I can see that. I probably would have done that, but now that's great. Like now I know that's my 2.0 will include
Yep.
that. So I really appreciate that part. I feel like that's something that's easily missed in our process.
Yeah. Well, and it's so funny because in like design school, it was kind of like like we were told, like, we're going to do multiple iterations and different concepts and continually refine to get to the final solution. And then when I was like working, like I had bosses who were kind of open to the concept, to like multiple concepts, and I had other bosses who were like, well, this should be like completed, why isn't it finished? And it's like, well, this is the first pass, like we just got the requirements, we're laying everything out, trying to make sure everything works. And of course there's going to be changes based on feedback or based on the client, or new requirements, or whatever the case is. But it's funny how in school it was kind of, they actually wanted multiple concepts and iterations, and then in the workplace that was kind of a hit or miss depending on what team I was with, and so it's just kind of really interesting. And again, so like relating back to what I'm doing now as an entrepreneur, it's constantly, putting something together, putting it out there to get feedback, and then refining it over time. And I think it's just really interesting, all the different progressions. But I think from design school, that's something that is not taught outside of design school. And I think that it should be,
Right.
like kind of that fail fast mentality, or that being open to feedback, or how to take constructive feedback to continue to refine and get better.
Well, I'm curious to find out from you, how does this idea of put something together, let's put it out there, get feedback, line up with where we started at the beginning, where you said, as an introvert, you were just really good at being productive on your own. So how does that line up now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what I've learned is that I can be kind of stuck in my head, and kind of producing in my head. But if I don't get the feedback, then I may be going off in a different direction, if it's for a client or for something outside of like a personal project. And even with a personal project, I should probably be getting feedback. So I think to tie it back to that first question, I think it's that, yes, I can be very productive on my own, but I think it's also important to have like outside feedback, or at least milestones of where you're checking in with others to make sure you're on the right path.
Yes, I agree with that. So similar, I mean, being a relational introvert myself, I struggle with the same thing at times where it's so easy to get into my own head of how to progress
Hmm.
and then leave aside what great input can come in from other people. And I think sometimes to recognize as well is just because somebody gives you input doesn't mean you have to take it.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what happens sometimes is people, like we might shy away from it because we're like, well, that means I have to do something. No, sometimes the input just helps you to think differently. It's not always
Hmm.
about, did you take exactly what they said? But I have 100% experienced the benefit of someone either, I mean, even with this podcast coming to life, someone asking me a question that I actually had not even considered is what opened the door for me to go, oh, I guess I can do that. And that wouldn't have happened had I not actually put that out there.
Yeah.
If I had just ruminated,
Hmm. Hmm.
it would be an idea at this point. So there is a balance between the two that it's not saying you have to completely be set aside your creative thinking. No, you have that creative mind there for a reason, but the people around you are there for a reason as well. And so how do we play with both of those things?
Yeah. Well, and I think going along that same theme, it's you also have to recognize the audience. If you're the creative, but you're creating for your client, you're serving them. And if you don't ask their feedback, you're doing a disservice to them. And so that's, I think, where as creatives sometimes like there's that disconnect. Like the creatives are like, well, I'm creative, I'll just come up with the idea and that'll be great. But a lot of times it doesn't work that way. Like, you've got to seek that feedback, and you're really creating for them, and you're helping extract their vision and making that vision come to life for them. And so if you put yourself in that position, in that mindset of how do I best serve my client, it becomes much, much different than if you keep thinking for yourself as a creative, oh, well, I know how to do this, and I'm going to just design this or figure it out for myself and they will like it. Like, that's a much different mindset versus actually being in service to your clients.
Yes, that's a really good point. Thinking, starting point being like, who am I serving? And if who I'm serving has never been solicited for any sort of thoughts or ideas, then I'm certainly missing a big piece of it. No, that makes perfect sense. Well, I'm looking at our time here, so we're kind of getting close on time. I'm curious to find out if what might you leave people with as we talk about play and the importance of play, especially as we think about adults. A lot of us maybe don't really think a lot about play. So how would you encourage us to think about that in our day to day?
Yeah, so I think like play doesn't have to be anything complicated. It could be like taking a few minutes to write, or it could be like taking a few minutes and like maybe you have a small Lego kit and you want to just build with Lego for a couple of minutes and like kind of like spark your imagination. That's what I like to do. Or maybe it's music or so. I mean, it's kind of like whatever you're kind of into. I think it's just a matter of setting aside some time each day or each week, or maybe even if it's on the weekend, but setting aside time just to be in that and kind of be in that area of what kind of play is to you, because it becomes a muscle. And if you continuously kind of build that into your life, then you can kind of start to apply that in other areas as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, how do we learn to build that muscle? And I love what you said about pay attention to the things that give you energy and pay attention to things that give you joy, because that then will help you not just in that moment, but in other areas of your life as well. So
Hmm.
that's really awesome. Well, Benjamin, I want to thank you for taking the time to be here today. And I love this conversation around play. And I feel that there's probably a lot of other people out there who either want to know more or maybe even have questions, which I would encourage anyone who's listening to the podcast, like drop it in the comments, share any questions that you might have. And Benjamin, if somebody does wants to reach out to you to find out a little bit more or to just engage a bit more in our conversation, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find if you just type in my name. I think I'm like the only one on LinkedIn with my last name. And so then the other way would be on my website. You can go to brandedworld.co, and you can contact me via the contact form.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you again, Benjamin, and for everyone listening in. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen, to get engaged. So again, if you have questions, if there's something that we haven't talked about and you feel that we needed to have talked about it, again, drop it in the comments. Feel free to reach out to Benjamin or myself. And I look forward to connecting with all of you very soon. And Benjamin, thank you again for joining today.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Bye, everyone.